Hi, everyone. We're in the enviable position of standing between you and the reception. So we'll try to make it worth your while if we can. I'm David Becker. I am the Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. I've worked in elections for over 20 years now, many of them serving as an attorney in the Justice Department. And I founded CEIR to help improve the integrity, security, and accuracy of elections, mostly in the United States, but also worldwide. You may have heard there's an election coming up in the United States, in 19 days to be precise. Just curious, how many in here who are eligible to vote plan to vote in this election? Okay, that's a lot of hands. Just remember, if you don't vote, you will have lied to me. Because people lie about voting all the time because they know they're supposed to do it. So what's going to happen, starting now actually, is about 100 million American citizens are going to go out and vote in this election to choose their government. In fact, over 2 million already have voted. And when you get that many people doing something like that, it's natural to have problems in a major election. And so you probably recall stories from previous elections where there were exceptionally long lines, or people are confused, or people aren't getting the right information, going to the wrong place, not sure what's on their ballot. And a few years back, someone who was very high up in government came to me and said, you know, I've got a great idea on how to fix this. He said, let's make elections like Jiffy Lube. Go on, I'm interested. So he said, no, hear me out. So oil changes used to be really, really tough. They used to take a long time, they were a big hassle, but then Jiffy Lube came along with a model, and people were in and out in 15 minutes, it was great. And I looked at him and I said, that's a great idea, because elections are just like oil changes. If everyone got an oil change on the very same day, every 2 to 4 years, in a building that was never designed for oil changes, conducted by someone who had never seen the underside of a car. So that's the challenges election officials face in this country. Everyone expects everything to go smoothly, but there's a lot going on during that election time. And so a few years back, I hosted a conference with about 200 leaders in the election field, people working campaigns, election officials from around the country, Republicans, Democrats, and I asked several of them, if there was one thing that we could work on and try to fix, what would it be? And it was pretty much unanimous. They all said voter registration, the voter lists. And the reason why is because almost all of the problems you see in elections when you're watching the news or you might personally experience are because there was an inaccurate or not up-to-date record in a voter's file. That can lead to long lines. It can affect even people behind that person in line and lead to longer lines. So why do we have such trouble keeping the voter lists up to date? There's one big answer for that: mobility. We as Americans are a very, very mobile society. 1 in 8 Americans moves in any given year, and that rate is about double amongst young Americans. And one thing about voter registration is people don't understand how it works. About a third of people think voter records just magically and automatically update. I moved, I told the post office, I told the motor vehicles, I maybe told nobody, but why isn't it magically updating? And about 50% of people don't know they can update their voter registration address at the DMV at the same time they're doing that. And that's despite the fact that's been federal law for a quarter of a century. Then adding to that is the pace of voter registration. Elections is a business with a 48-month cycle. I don't know of any other business like that, where 46 months of that cycle, things move on at a pretty easy clip, and then for about 1 to 2 months, they spike off the charts. What this means is if someone moved in January of 2017, the election officials probably aren't going to know about it until October of 2020. In the meantime, they're not getting any information about the elections that are relevant to them, where their polling place is, and election officials are sending mail out to someone who doesn't need it because they're not there anymore. So we did some research on this. I led some research a few years back to try to quantify exactly how out of date the voter lists are. Here's what we found. About 1.8 million records of deceased individuals are still on the rolls. I choose to call them having voted or aged out of voting. And then about 2.7 million people were registered in multiple states. Now, were these people committing fraud? No. These people had moved out of their state, had gone to the new state, and done what they were supposed to do, which is register to vote because they were good citizens. but there was no way that their old state ever could find out about that. There's no method for that. And in fact, there are people here in this room right now who have more than one voter registration record somewhere in the United States. And you have no intention of casting 2 ballots. It's not fraud. It's just an administrative inefficiency. So all told, we did the math and came up with a number of about 24 million records that were out of date at any given point in time. That's about 1 in 8 voter records in the United States. This has real consequences, because when people show up at the polls and they try to vote and their record's out of date, they can't be given a regular ballot. And some of these people leave without voting. And about 300,000 votes, it was estimated, were lost due to registration problems in 2016. 2016 was an election in which about 100,000 votes decided the election in 3 states. And then we have another problem with voter registration. Not enough people are on the lists. About 1 in 3 eligible voters isn't on the list anywhere. That's 73 million people. So this is a very difficult problem. We were trying to solve it. It's a problem I love to get my hands around. And what I did is I formed a working group of about 40 experts, election officials, people from both parties, researchers. And it occurred to me that this might not be just a policy problem. This might be a data problem. In that election officials will tell you one of the things they have a great deal of difficulty with is even when they do get information, they might have a John Doe on their voter list and a John Doe from some other data source, but there's no way to say with any degree of certainty that they are the same John Doe. This actually goes to so much of the private sector problems and government, taking data from 2 different sources and trying to reconcile it and say it matches to the same individual. So I started asking around to find someone who might know something about this, and I got the name Jeff Jonas. And so I called him up and asked him if he would take part. Jeff, I'll let you tell the rest of the story.
I was sitting there minding on my own business, and he calls me and goes, "Hey, do you want to be part of a working group? We're going to write a report." He's lucky I have this Jim Carrey yes man problem, if you've seen the movie, because I knew I shouldn't, but I was like, yeah, yes, ah. But as it turned out, they needed this thing called record matching. The term of art for it these days, though, is called entity resolution. This is my definition. It's recognizing when 2 things are the same, 2 identities are the same, despite having been described differently. But in fact, the converse is true, is recognizing when 2 observations relate to different identities despite having been described similarly. Here I've just added a JR and SR. There's only now 1 letter different. And you have experienced this yourself in probably many different ways. If your contact list in your phone has duplicates, that's an entity resolution problem. When you get duplicate mailings. When I go to a hotel and check in and I say, look up my loyalty club number, and they say, which one of you are you in here of these 3 in Vegas? And I'm like, they're all me. We see banks kicking customers out in Hong Kong for doing money laundering, and then they just turn right back up in India with a different passport. That's an entity resolution problem. And when evil people try to sneak into the country and all they do is change 1 letter in their immigration form, and our government misses them, well, that's an entity resolution problem. So I've been building systems like this, built one for the casinos. It became known as NORA, non-obvious relationship awareness. They're trying to keep clever, bad people out. IBM buys it from me in 2005, buys my company. They call it Identity Insight. And in 2009, I went to an executive in IBM and said, will you give me $50 million to build something? I'm going to code name it G2, and I want to create an AI that will do entity resolution. Not use AI to do entity resolution, but I want to build an AI that does it. It's human smart, but doesn't need humans to train it or tune it. And they let me get started. And I'm obsessed with this because I can only build one thing. That's what I would want to work on next. And I'm obsessed with entity resolution because it's so fundamental to all forms of intelligence. Not just machine intelligence, but if we're walking around the conference and I see you and recognize you from somewhere, that's entity resolution. It's in biology. I don't know if any of you have seen this called the lion whisperer. The beginning of this video is like this. The guy's standing there in Africa and he's going, oh, it's been a while since I've seen him, but I was raised with them. Here, kitty, kitty, kitty. You're thinking, how's this going to turn out? So kitty, kitty, a couple of them come running at him and then give him a big hug. That's entity resolution. So before I show you how entity resolution was applied to voter registration, I'm going to take you through something, a little 101 class I like to call slow motion entity resolution. I spent 30 hours on the next few charts, so I want you to really work this. Look at these 3 records and tell me, or consider, I should say, is this 1 person, 2, or 3? Yes. How many think it's 1? How many think it's 2? 3 people. Well, let's take a look at this record. The first record and the third record share the same name, address, and cell phone. The first record and the second record share a name, a cell phone, and the date of birth, except it's only month and day transposed. It turns out this is a pretty safe bet to put these 3 records into 1. Now this one here is pretty easy, same person or different. The point is here, you can't just take the same email address and assume 2 people are the same. Too many families share email addresses. So you have to keep this out. We would think of it as a discovered relationship. And while I'm on relationships, this is kind of a freebie, but you also learn disclosed relationships. This is the spouse, maybe on the employment application or the bank loan. Now take a look at record 6. Compare it to record 1. Similar name, same date of birth. Would you be really sure it's the same person? Not so much. So you have to hold that out. You have to be pessimistic. You have to just call it a possible match. It would take some human or some more information to become sure about this. Now this has been a tricky one over the years in entity resolution. Where would you put this record? Who is it? If you're not careful, it just gets randomly assigned to record 1 or 4, which would be really bad, because if record 7 said like, shoot on sight, then you're like 50-50 got the wrong person. And then the next recommendation would be send the family flowers. Okay. And so in this case, if that entity E1 in the center didn't exist, you could be pretty confident that record 7 was part of E2 in record 4, and vice versa. If record 4 didn't exist, you could be pretty sure it was part of E1, but because they both exist, it really could be either. And so you just really, to be pessimistic, you have to keep it out. Now take a close look at this record here and compare it to record 2. Name, address, cell phone, good. It's going to become part of E1. But does anybody want to bark out what they think might else happen? Yeah, so what you learn when record 8 becomes part of E1, you learn an email address. And because of that, record 6 now is not just name and date of birth. Record 6 is name, date of birth, and email address. Not date of birth. But now it conjoins. Now this one here is actually really hard to do at scale. Record number 9 shows up, and compare it to record 3. The name's the same, except it's got senior. It's got the same driver's license number, but the date of birth is not like 1 and 2. The moment this record shows up, it reveals to you that record 3 is really the senior, and you've had a false positive. You've put 2 people together when you shouldn't have. And so when 9 shows up, you have to pull 3 out. 2 more. I spent a lot of time on that part. Okay. Record 10, think about where that goes. What you'll notice is that it shares an address with 1 and 3, but nothing else. It shares the name with record 6, the AKA. It shares a phone with record 2. Most entity resolution systems are trying to compare it to records like that. But if you think about it, inside of that record E1 with all those records in it, has been learning the name and the AKA, both phone numbers, all the addresses. And so record 10 doesn't match any single record, but it matches that whole identity. This, by the way, turns out to be really important to catch clever bad people, because clever bad people don't use the same name, address, phone, driver's license on every record. Only the idiots do that, and they run out of gas on the way to the operation. They take wet matches to the bomb. Okay. And finally, very GDPR-ish is, what if you are obligated by law to delete record 8? Or it expires. When you lose 8, you have to remember, you have to unlearn why 6 was a member. So the moment you delete 8, you have to be able to pull 6 out, and you're not sure about 10 anymore either. So that's entity resolution kind of 101. I've not had a room, I've surveyed people, and it's really difficult for a human being to just keep this in their head and get those different moves correct. And so here's how it applies now to voter registration. Here you have 2 voter records, and now that I've turned you on to entity resolution experts, those 2 records, they're in 2 different states, 2 different addresses, Maryland, Virginia. They share a name that's similar and a date of birth, but that's not enough. Each state has its own driver's license number. But election offices have access to DMV data, and this DMV record finds its home here because of the name, the address, and the date of birth, and the driver's license. And that left side has just learned a social security number. And the Virginia office has access to DMV, and this record shares the name, date of birth, and Virginia driver's license, and it connects this way. And now both sides have the same name, date of birth, and social. So the moment that final record shows up in the lower right, it does that. So the architecture of the system is like this. These records are arriving from these different election offices, their voter and DMV data. And then it allows this central database to produce recommendations. For example, ask Maryland, let them know that maybe their voter has moved so they can contact the voter. And that's where this thing, G2, is entity resolving these records. Now we did one more thing. It's a privacy by design feature. Name and address are public record, but driver's license, social security number, and date of birth are not. And so what we did is we anonymized these. Kind of watch this close. I don't know how to show you. It's going to jiggle. And then go to hashed values. So it's hashed with the secret key there. And then when it arrives in the center where the index is built, it's hashed again. And this helps reduce the risk of unintended disclosure if somebody was listening into the pipe or steals the database. And so this is what I helped with designing in this working group. And then what happens next is the hard part.
So now fast forward to 2012. Well, before that, I should actually say, we're sitting, when Jeff first kind of roughly sketches out the architecture for this, a room of about 35, 40 hardened, cynical election souls who'd been struggling with this problem for decades. And he puts it out, and this hush fell over the room for a second. And then one of them, a Secretary of State of a big state, she literally gasped, and we all kind of cracked up for a second. But it was because all of them saw for the first time there was a path forward to fixing this really insoluble problem. And that was ultimately to create something we call the Electronic Registration Information Center, or to make it a little more manageable, we call it ERIC for short. So we launched ERIC in 2012. It's a 501c3. States voluntarily can choose to join, and the states that participate run ERIC. ERIC is not run by me. It's not run by the government. It's run by, or at least the federal government, it's run by a board of the states that participate. And the first 7 states that joined in 2012 were Washington, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. And then fast forward to today, we now have 24 states plus DC in ERIC. States that range from as blue as Connecticut, Delaware, and Oregon to as red as Louisiana, Utah, and Alabama. I challenge you to find any voluntary organization that has those states in it doing the same thing in the same way. And you'll see in light blue there, kind of aqua, Florida and Massachusetts have both passed bills to join as of next year. That will take the membership in ERIC over about the 50% of the American population threshold. what's really remarkable is the success Eric has had in enabling these states in a very non-political, non-partisan way to keep their lists more up to date. And I'm going to give you a little insight into that. First, one of the things Eric has found in just 6 years, it's identified over 7.2 million records of voters who have moved in their same state. Now think about this for a second. These voters, the way Eric discovered it, is because they told DMV that they had moved. Elections never heard of it. So the citizen did exactly what they were supposed to do. And government didn't have its act together to share that information with other agencies. Because of this, these 7.2 million voters were able to get their addresses up to date, meaning they're getting information on elections that are relevant to them, not elections at their old address. They know where to vote. They know when an election happens. Then in addition, Eric has identified over 2.2 million registered voters who had moved out of the state. There was no way for states to do this before. So person moves from Colorado to Utah. Colorado learns they've moved out. They confirm that information consistent with federal law. Utah then can actually invite them to register, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Eric also identified 220,000 people who've aged out of voting. And that's very, very helpful because one of the things that people are very worried about is the potential for fraud. And although this happens extremely rarely, it's really good when election officials can demonstrate that they've done what they need to do to keep the voter lists up to date, even as people are dying, and remove them from the list. And then lastly, Eric does something really interesting. Eric identifies in all of the states that participate people who are eligible but who are not yet on the voter list. And the states agree that they're going to contact every single one of those people and invite them to register, usually by secure and efficient online voter registration. As a result, millions of new registered voters, I estimate that somewhere between 5 and 6 million in just 6 years, by definition new, because they weren't on the list before, are now on the voter list in the Eric states. This is the single most effective voter registration drive in the history of the United States, as far as I know. It wasn't conducted by candidates. It wasn't conducted by political parties. It wasn't conducted by ideologues. It was done by government in an equal basis, on a nonpartisan basis, all across the country. And all of that information is accurate and up to date. And none of this would have been possible but for the technology that Jeff gave to Eric. And
tell them how many people in the IT department of this Eric organization that has almost 300 million records, probably 80 different files, and running half the states. How many people in their IT department in total?
There's one full-time person.
Long live AI.
And the states are finding the data to be of incredibly high quality. It's enabling them to serve their voters better. And while this might all seem very esoteric to people who don't work like I do in elections all the time, when you go vote in a state that's participating in Eric, you're going to see the benefits because there are going to be shorter lines. There's going to be less of a possibility you're going to have to cast a provisional ballot or be told you have to go somewhere else. There's going to be more likelihood that you get your stuff in your mailbox on time and can vote early if you want to or by mail. And this is all thanks to both the technology that Jeff provided, but also the privacy features, because one of the things that's very important as we're dealing with voter data, although a lot of voter data is public information, as Jeff pointed out, date of birth, social, driver's license is not, and it's protected in every state that I know of. And so it was very important that we made sure that although we wanted the utility from being able to use that information to connect the dots, to fit the puzzle pieces together, that we could protect that data at the same time and Eric wouldn't become a privacy problem. So I'm really glad we got a chance to meet and work on this, man.
I think it was really his policy work. The entity resolution part really isn't that hard. It's not magic. So I was watching David lead the policy work to make all of this happen. And it's been a project that the team and I are really most proud of about what entity resolution's done. So it's super exciting. And then I actually spun G2 out in a one-of-a-kind spin-out into the Senzing company, and we're still helping on the project and still helping David as his aspirations to help roll this out across more states. Anyway.
Thanks for having us.